you can't make creativity uniform.
Right. Be creative now. Business is messy and unpredictable.
Sometimes lonely.
So lonely.
So lonely.
And inspiration can often come from really weird places.
We pick up where the bullet point blogs and the highlight reels leave off.
We start with the stories. Welcome back to So Here's My Story. I'm Jody.
I'm Elliot.
And Elliot's story today is very entertaining. I didn't see the punchline of that one coming. And we ended up talking about everything from how to get the most out of your people to what does and doesn't work with incentivizing behaviors. And, it can't be a bad episode if you reference Les Nessman.
No, it cannot.
We just one quick thing. If you haven't picked up our special episode, you can get that by texting the word story to 345-345. And if you visit sohere'smystory.com, you can find links to all the cool places that we have things, including links to jump into our Facebook group. We saved you a seat.
Yes, we did. But before we go,
okay,
I do want to send out a happy birthday wish.
Oh, right.
Yes, to one of our community members, a great friend of the podcast,
huge supporter of the
podcast, Denise Buckman.
Yay,
happy
Denise.
birthday.
Although it'll be a week late at this point.
Happy belated. Today, when we're recording it, is your
today,
birthday.
Not episode drop day. So anyway.
Right. But happy birthday.
Happy birthday, Denise.
So here's my story. And actually, I'm going to have to come clean on this one. This isn't technically my story.
Oh, okay. I wonder why you were smirking.
Yeah, I heard it from somebody, and I thought it was too good not to share on the podcast. So a friend of mine was at a large medical facility, and she was walking back to the doctor's office. We were going to have a consultation. So she was being led back through this labyrinth of cubicles, and she passed this one cubicle, and there was this, it wasn't a velvet rope, though that's how I imagined it when she told it. There was this rope or tape-like thing across the opening to the cubicle, and there was a sign on it that said "Out to lunch." And she thought, well, that was weird as she was passing it. But then she looked back, and the woman, the occupant of the cubicle, was still in there, just head back, chair reclined, sleeping.
Wait, what?
Yeah. So she was sleeping in the middle of this cubicle farm. This woman just had apparently she'd done this before because she's prepared, right? She has the rope. She stretched across the cubicle entry so you don't come in. And then.
And someone did confirm that she didn't just have a heart attack or a stroke while eating lunch. I'm assuming because
she was in the middle of a medical facility and she doesn't have a private office. I don't know if she had a car or whatever, or that she couldn't do that. And it just struck me funny that this is the way she chose to appear, and she's going to occupy the cubicle, and she's going to be there. And it reminded me in a weird way of two things, actually. One was just WKRP, Les Nessman, how he always wanted to have an office. So he had duct tape on the floor where walls would someday be, and you had to knock.
Yes.
But anyway.
And if you don't know that reference, you're not old enough to listen to the podcast. No,
correct.
That's not true.
But what it reminded me of was, in my days where my peers were associates in large law firms, they would routinely talk about the fact that they had to be in and at their desk at a certain time in the morning because partners would walk around and basically do bed check. They'd walk around and they'd make sure, desk check, make sure that you're there. And it didn't matter if you had been at the office until 10 o'clock that evening, because if you weren't at the office by 8 o'clock in the morning, you were a slacker. And so the reason this came up is because there was a network of associates, and you had to be in that network, who would make sure if you weren't going to be there, they would fill a coffee mug, and they would make sure there was a coffee mug on your desk with steaming coffee. And that's just what you did for each other, so that if somebody walked by and they'd say,
is that like a normal thing? Is that?
I don't know, because I'd never.
Dear listeners, please let me know. I've never heard of such a thing. I don't know if I'm just naive.
So I had never worked in a large organization like that. And I'd never worked in one where, it's so important to be there regardless of the work being done. Just the appearances are so important. But both of those struck me that people decided what was important, that physically being there was important, and that's how they're going to be judged. And I was just struck by the fact that in a lot of organizations, you are judged by things that are pretty irrelevant. And here, for example, I was actually at mediation, and we were talking because there's a lot of downtime in mediation. Mediation is basically 15 minutes of action packed into 7 hours. So there's a lot of downtime. And somebody had mentioned that something happened at 10 o'clock in the morning at my office. And so Lacey, who was with me at mediation, said, "Oh, well, I hadn't gotten in yet." And so my client was giving her a really hard time about not having gotten in at 10. Well, so I was explaining, no, there's something that we call Lacey time. Because Lacey,
Lacey, not lazy time.
Right, Lacey, okay, Lacey time. Lacey will stay till 7, 8, 9 o'clock in the evening. She'll be here on the weekends when the work demands it, whatever. But she's not a morning person. So she does not get in at 8, 8:30, 9, or 10. It doesn't matter.
And you don't have this like really rigorous, like team structure, like a design team or something, where her not being here is holding other people up.
Correct.
And whatnot. So she gets the work done. And
she gets the work done. And if we had court as we did that day, she was there on time. If we had a
sorry,
client
Judge,
meeting,
I'm not a morning person.
Right. Exactly. They love that.
How to get in with judges.
But if we had a client meeting that's at 8 in the morning, she'd be there. But otherwise, this was the first place that she had ever worked where I told her, I just want you to do your work well. Right. I don't really care about being here at 8 o'clock in the morning.
Okay, so there's lots of stuff that I want to jump into on that you were just mentioning, but I need to back up for a minute because there's sort of this like dual layer of funny about that story to me, that if you just pause at the part where, like, had she looked in the cubicle and the person was actually eating lunch, I already think that's noteworthy. I mean, we could do a whole episode just on that, where, you know, it's an interesting way to set a boundary that's like a little bit funny, but, you know, it keeps you from, I could see if somebody needs like their downtime at lunch and they get interrupted all the time and they feel like a jerk being like, could you leave me alone? I'm trying to eat lunch. So, you know, you could set that boundary. If you have a door, you can shut your door. But if you don't, you're a cubicle. You don't have a way to set that. And if you don't want to go outside or go sit in your car, I get it. I would still find it really funny because just imagine that interaction for just a second. And I'm such a big fan of setting healthy boundaries. And yet I'm still like slightly uncomfortable with this one for some reason. You know, imagine somebody comes by, they want to ask you about something, whether that's a social connection or they need something from you professionally. And you watch them look at the sign, like look at you and then walk away.
Right, because I would
allow that to happen.
If I were the one in the cubicle, I would just look at them, not say a word. I'd look at the sign, they'd look at the sign, and I'd wait to see what kind of unspoken dialogue is going to proceed here.
That in and of itself could just be a hysterical scene in a movie. But then you add this other layer of they've got this out, like this very specific out to lunch sign that apparently they can just use for any reason as if it's a shut door. Like, I mean, you know, anyway, it brings up all sorts of questions. Like, why not have taken a quick nap?
Right. Well, I don't, and where do you get that? And I also want to know, you know, there's the poles at the movie theater where you have the roll of that rope and you can kind of the elastic thing and you can stretch it. Where do you get those?
I actually know where you get those, but that's not. We're not going to go to that. I think that would be
really cool. And I'm wondering how elaborate her out to lunch thing is. But anyway,
I wish we had a picture. I'm a little disappointed that we don't have a picture.
I asked if she had taken a picture. She said no. She felt really bad because this person is guiding her through and the lady's sleeping. Yeah.
So I get that. So I just not wanted to step over, but it is fascinating that then the person is, first of all, just being comfortable enough to kick back and take a nap,
which I could never do, by the way.
Not like that. I have shut my door when I had an office and laid down and taken a nap.
But the people that fall asleep, like in college, they fall asleep in the library. I could never do that.
Really interesting. I don't know if I ever slept in the library. Anyway, okay, let's move on though to this, because I do think this is really important about the, I really do want to hear from listeners if that is a real thing that people like put steaming cups of coffee out to sort of make the look of FaceTime.
I like the fellowship of that, though.
It is like a secret society. So I'm fascinated, but I do like the deeper thinker part of me really does think about it in terms of if I had a client where their people were doing that, I would really want, like, you can't miss the fact that clearly that company is focusing on the wrong things.
And everybody knows it.
And everybody knows it, and they know how to game the system. And so they think something is important. And not only are they not measuring it the way they think they are, because there's a process in play to sort of dupe the system. But more importantly, I would just really want to question, like, is it that why do you care about people being there at a certain time? Sometimes there is a rational reason. Like when I worked at the architecture firm, we had a little bit mix of both, because architecture is a very intense and time laborious kind of thing. There's tons of overtime quite often. And so we didn't have a be at your desk at 8:30. We trusted people, much like you do with Lacey, to get their work done at the time. But there was also the flip side to it, is that, you don't do a project all by yourself. There is a team dynamic to it. And if you don't come in till noon, just because you were there till 10 o'clock, then you're usually a lot of times holding someone else up.
Right. Well, that's a difference. Yes.
So it's not that being there certain times doesn't matter, but I'm shocked at how often it is the focus when someone can't tell me why it matters. They just feel like it should matter somehow, that it's the thing. And I often, it's a really interesting thing to kind of step back and say, the behaviors that I am noticing, acknowledging, maybe even rewarding, are they the behaviors that I really care about? Are they leading to the outcomes that I really care about? The time thing is one thing. I had a company who always would look at overtime hours and when they were considering bonuses. And it's not that those aren't important, because they are indicative of people who have gone above and beyond to, really bring a project home. But you have to know the story behind it, because otherwise it's just, if you're getting rewarded for clocking hours, that doesn't necessarily mean those hours were necessary or useful.
I'll tell you, there was a study done. I wish I could quote the study, but I know it was around 2015, 2016, that showed that people who work from home, or what they used to call telecommute, their bonuses for what was the same level of productivity, their bonuses were significantly lower. I think the figure that sticks in my mind was 23% lower on average. And really the only conclusion, that it wasn't job title, it wasn't output and deliverables, it was face time.
And interestingly, and I've never seen the two compared, I have seen studies that say that actually people working from home end up doing more because they're nervous about not being visible. So they actually try a little extra harder, at least some of them anyway. No, exactly. And it's another place I saw a similar kind of thing happen. I had a friend, and this wasn't a client, this was just a friend of mine who was he's not in sales per se, but a big part of his job is generating his own business. And then he has another core delivery service that is what he does, but he kind of has to deliver, find leads and nurture new client relationships. And he's very successful. He meets and exceeds all of his sales goals always. And the company was bought out by another company. And that company has these standards in place where there are all these behaviors that they have decided are lead indicators of success on the other side. So you have to make 20, and for them, it has been very successful. You have to make, I'm making this up, like 27 phone calls each week and 3 just sort of pop by office visits to current clients or whatever it is. And they wanted to track and measure that. None of these things, or very few of these things, are things that my friend does. And so he was trying to have the conversation with them. Well, can you explain to me why you care if I do the behaviors and their rationale was, well, because these behaviors lead to like the right amount of sales. He's like, right, but I'm getting the sales. So do you really care how I do them? And this part I can kind of go 50-50 on there. Like, well, we just know that when we have a culture that this is the expectation, then everybody does well. Like maybe you can do well without doing them, but to have a, reliably consistent team that does it, they have to do these behaviors. So I get that that's worth a conversation, but I cannot step over the fact that you're like, okay, if I'm already generating X, why do I have to do Y?
Well, and so I think that comes down, and this is a great question. How does the organization deal with outliers?
Oh,
right.
Yes,
and so, so there are two things that occurred to me. One is I had that kind of exact conversation that you were talking about with your contact when I was an associate at a law firm, and I got called down by the partners, and all the partners were sitting there saying, your billable hours are on the low side of average for our associates. And I said, but I'm bringing in more business than anybody around this table except for one of you. Which I was. And that's what they really wanted. And they said, yes, that's great. That's what we really want. But your billable hours are lower. And I'm like, but anybody can generate the billable hours, but I'm bringing more. So,
and you were generating billable hours for other people.
Yes.
Right?
Yes. For other people. So I was acting as a partner in an associate role, and I was doing it better than all the other partners except for the named managing partner. And it was still a source of friction.
Were you able to follow that through to, okay, so would you like me to stop generating
No, they just wanted you to do both. They wanted me to generate the business because that's where the money was. And they also said, but it's still a concern. And they couldn't get off of that it was still a concern because in that environment, I was an outlier. And I will tell you that the first time that I ran into this, and it was just a minor thing, and I was so impressed with it, is in high school. I went to Gilman. And for those of you who are not in the Baltimore area, Gilman is a very upper crust, staid, blue blood type of high school prep school. And I was one of their diversity projects. Very proud of that. So anyway, because I didn't have a Roman numeral after my name. But so I went to Gilman.
Diversity project.
And at one of our exam periods, one of my very close friends got up from his desk during exams, and everybody's the old room with the wooden desks and all that stuff. He got up and he perched himself in a windowsill. We had those big, wide windowsills that are almost as wide as a table. He perched himself there with his paper and a pad, and he just started looking out the window, and he would write his exam, and he would do this. Now, I was fascinated because I had never, in this environment particularly, seen anybody get up and wander anywhere during an exam.
You're like, is that allowed?
Yeah, right. Is that allowed? Can you do that? But the teachers were like, well, that's fine. That's just Carl. He's not doing anything. He's not cheating on anybody. He's just, and it was the first time that I had seen this very structured and staid place deal with an outlier, albeit in a small way. And I thought, well, that's right. He's not cheating. He's not doing anything wrong. And if that's how he gets his work done, then why can't he do that?
Okay, now we're in a terrible place because I actually have 3 points I want to make, and they're all different. They go in 3 different directions. So I'm like, oh no, which one do I pick? So I'm just gonna try to make a couple of these quickly. To stay on the school theme for a second, and I at one time was thinking about doing a whole episode on this because of my children's and actually my husband's and my own undiagnosed learning disabilities. My kids have always that has been an important part of their path in lives is us finding a place where outliers are dealt with in a particular way. Because they are reliably outliers. And it's so fascinating to me. Turner has he's a sophomore, my son, sophomore in high school. He has a couple professors who, when we're talking about incentives or like what you focus on and what you measure, they routinely get really clear on what skill they're trying to teach in that moment. So because of the learning challenges, he has this teacher, Mr. Hooper, who is just fascinating. And one of the things he does with these boys, because it's all boys, is for their English class this year, you can do unlimited revisions to anything you submit. And his goal is not to have you do 22 revisions. His hope is that, as you progress through his classes, that then you need less revisions because nobody likes to do revisions. But I love that because I could see somebody saying, well, you should have to do a good job the first time. Why let you try again if you don't get it? That is an important lesson for someone to learn. But first, he wants them to realize that they sort of explore the gap between their first effort and what it takes to get up to a certain amount. And my son, who's not one to just sort of, he's not going to do the extra credit terribly often, but this version of, I'll call it extra credit, although it's not, for some reason, extra effort. Yeah. And he's really taken to it. And over the course of this year and a half he's had him, he needs less and less revisions to get to the grade that satisfies him. And not only that, but the grade that satisfies him has raised. Like he'll do revisions until he gets a 99 or 100. Before, if he'd gotten a 92 on something, he'd be, or even frankly, probably an 88, he'd be like, close enough, good enough. Yeah. So I think that's interesting. But I'll leave this other one for later because this one does tie into the incentives thing. I can't say that I'm against incentive programs and incentive, sales goals and incentives and whatnot, because I know they serve a purpose. I have to believe somewhere they're done well. But almost every place I have ever seen incentive programs of any kind put into place, they often end up incentivizing the wrong behavior.
They do. Yes.
They end up sort of, not that people are even dishonestly trying to game the system. It's just that it comes back to the hours thing. If you know that your boss values hours, then you're going to make sure that you're there.
Yes.
And whereas if you value, and no matter how you sort of try to restack it, it's just so easy to incentivize the wrong behaviors. Even when you try to think it all the way through, you're like, oh shoot, I didn't think of that. Now they're just going to do this because it looks like that's what I value. So I just think that's
right. It's, and I think we mentioned this before. It's like the ISO 9000. If you value efficiency, that means that you could turn out and hit all of your marks if you're turning out a great number of concrete life jackets, right? Because you're efficient and you're turning out everything. And so, yeah, I see that all the time.
But if that's what you want, then that's great. There's nothing wrong with that. But if you want people to be, say, innovative or creative, then you have to value risk.
Well, you have
to value, and
you have to value risk. You have to value mistakes. You also have to allow for the outliers, because the way that I am creative and where I find my creative space and when I find my creative space is not the same as those things for you or for my peer. So you can't make creativity uniform.
Right. Be creative now. No, so this is even just the fact that we're calling them outliers is part and parcel to this fascination for me. In again, back to architecture, at least with the kind of projects we were doing, this is probably not the same for private clients as much, but there's a thing called means and methods. You can't you can't say in the specifications, use this exact brand of windows. You have to say, use a window that meets this criteria. And you can try to make it as specific as possible if you want something pretty specific, but you have to just say it has to meet these quality standards or be made of this or whatever. Same thing with the with how the contractor phases it. You can't say do this first, then do this first. Right. You can set your quality standards, you can set the outcomes that you want, but then you're not allowed to tell people how to get there or exactly what products to use or what the phasing should look like. And that is challenging when you think you know what it is. But I see it all the time where, somebody comes in and the leadership or the director of that, they want to tell the person exactly how to do it. Whereas, and I get that if you're in a bigger team, if you're trying to scale something, you can't have everybody doing things their own way. So I'm not that disillusioned about it. But sometimes the right who comes with their own how. And maybe it just needs a smaller amount of space that they can do it their own way. Because otherwise, if you sort of describe it out to the tiniest little level, then you can't be surprised when you have people that are acting in a take tab B, stick in slot A kind of way, because you've left them no room to navigate with what they're bringing to the table.
Yeah. And I actually had an ongoing situation all of last year with that. I had a client that was doing a construction project for a very large entity. And my client was new to this owner. And the owner had worked with other people in similar projects before. Well, my client approached it differently. Now, the owner was very worried about this. It didn't matter that the others were well behind schedule, but he was used to their way of doing things, and my client was doing it differently.
Yeah. Please do it this way, but get a different outcome.
Right. And so we were called in every 2 weeks by the owner. And I say we because my client was really worried that something was being teed up against them. Yeah. So they said, I want you to come in. And I used to joke to the people around here, they're just bringing me in to get yelled at by the owner. And actually, as it turned out, my client was the only one that fully performed and got it done exactly on time. And the ones that were doing it the way the owner had really known that it should be done, quote unquote, were well behind schedule. But my point is that the owner gave my client a much harder road to travel because he was scrutinizing them to the point where they had to keep pulling resources off the project to explain their means and methods, not because the results were worse, because they were hitting their marks,
right,
but because the results were different. And this organization did not know how to deal with an outlier.
Yeah, well, but just even that concept of outlier, because I think what we keep coming back to, there are situations, and there are, I guess I'd say, people who need things laid out for them in a very like what next kind of way. Yeah. So I don't dispute that those circumstances exist, but it's so much easier and I don't know, not as much just rigorous effort. And maybe that seems more palatable to me because of how my brain works, to say like, I want this outcome and I'm going to describe it really clearly. I don't really care how you do it or how you, it's funny. I went through this exact same process when my assistant Karen came on to take over all my scheduling, because logistical scheduling triggers some really unfortunate part of my brain that like wildly overthinks things and makes them really complicated, and they just don't need to be. So I realized that has to go to someone else. So Karen came on, and prior to that, in my attempts to overcompensate for that part of my brain, I had all these systems in place. Like I log it here and then it's like this. And so without really thinking much, I initially started having her try and use my system. And there were all these stumbling blocks. I'm like, oh, maybe I don't have the right person, whatever. And then one day I heard her, because we work virtually together. And she was like, well, hold on. I was like, wait, are you like, you have your own way of doing it? She goes, yeah, I take what you do there and I keep it here in this log. And that's what I use to make sure. Cause it's fine, your system. She was like, it doesn't like click for me. Right. And I said, do you need what I do at all? She's like, no, when you tell me about it, I put it over here. And I was like, let's try this. Let's just stop using my thing. You use your thing. If it's a problem, we can always go back, but I don't need this we've never looked back. Like and it's so much easier for me. I just sort of like tell her, I'm like, hey, we got that thing, and she captures it all and logs it.
She has a Jody translator. I need me one of those.
Exactly.
So that's our story.
But the discussion doesn't have to end here.
No, it does not.
In fact, we don't want it to.
No, we don't.
That is why we actually have our private Facebook group,
which we started to make sure that we could get your comments, your rants, your thoughts,
your stories.
You
can find links to that group, as well as show notes and links to subscribe via email, and how to find us just about anywhere you can possibly find podcasts at sohere'smystory.com.
And you can also find us on Facebook and Twitter at SHMS Podcast.
And since we know it takes a village.
Yes, it does.
We'd like to thank our village, our super talented, incredibly patient team.
And occasionally snarky team.
Yeah, but in the best of ways.
In the best of ways.
Snarky.
Yes.
Good mockery.
So a huge shout out to the people who actually help us produce our show. First, our sound engineer, Tom Hansen.
Thanks to Christy Schmier for our brilliant show notes and all the other fantastic writing she does for us.
And to Taylor Mathauer for doing just a little bit of everything.
Including wrangling us.
Which
is no small feat.
No, it's not.
This is Jody Hume.
And I'm Elliot Wagenheim.
And you've been listening to So Here's My Story.